What's up, podcast? Welcome to episode 30 of Powerline Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Lucas, and wow, guys, episode 30. This is amazing. March 27th of 2019, I had this crazy idea. Well, the idea started a year or two prior to March 1st of March 27th of 2019, but one full year. I've had this show running for now. The end of March of 2019, like I said, was episode number 1 of Powerline Podcast. I was nervous, completely nervous, to be honest, about starting this thing. I had no idea how to start a podcast. Learned so much in doing it all. I remember just hours on YouTube and crushing the internet trying to figure out how to make this work. And I've done that throughout the whole year here, trying to find parts and pieces of gear to make it work and what software works for this and that. But put it all together, 30 episodes this year. I'm very proud of that. And I'm very proud of the community that we've started to build here. And I hope it grows immensely, because this is such a cool thing to be a part of. And I just wanted to say I love each and every one of you. I hope that all of you are doing your best to protect yourselves and your family during this confusing time in the world right now. I know that there's a lot going on, and whatever your views or thoughts on it are, I just hope that you're really taking it into consideration to protect yourself, protect your family, protect your bucket partners, and be safe out there, guys. That's all I'll say about that. But episode 30, my guest for this episode, his name is James Geering. Some of you might recognize James. He is a podcast host himself. He hosts the podcast called Behind the Shield. So if you have not heard of him or have not heard of Behind the Shield, stop this right now. Go into whatever podcast app it is that you listen to the show on and like and subscribe to Behind the Shield. He has about 300 guests now, or just shy of 300 guests over 3 years. He's been host of this show. He is a fireman and paramedic with a beautiful heart for service and cares deeply for humanity. Like I said, guys, James has had some amazing guests on his show. Almost 300 now. I had the privilege to be a guest on his show. You can get on there and check that out. It was a great show. I think it was about an hour and a half long. We covered so many good topics. What I really love about Behind the Shield is that it's very relatable to a lot of the things that we deal with in the line industry. So I can't recommend the show enough. You can find him on social at Behind the Shield 911 on Instagram. Just Google James Geering or Behind the Shield and you'll find his stuff, find his content. Get on there, like, subscribe, all the good stuff. Give him 5 stars, comments, ratings, all that good stuff. He so deserves it. So like I said, almost 300 guests. He's got a lot of content now and had a lot of great conversations himself. So I had the privilege, like I said, to be on his show, and he was so gracious enough to return the favor and come and talk on Powerline Podcast. So we talk a little bit about how James got into being a fireman and a bit in his background and history. And then we took a little bit of a deep dive into a couple of subjects that I've wanted to talk about on this show for quite a while. One of them being physical fitness. James is also a CrossFit coach and has been a lifelong athlete. So we do quite a bit of conversation on that. And then another subject that is very, very important in today's world, and I'm so happy this subject's being talked more and more about lately, is mental health. Mental health is a subject that it's something that affects a lot of people in various different ways. So we talk about a wide range of different things regarding mental health. And if none of this stuff applies to you or whatever, please think about the other people in your life that maybe this episode could help touch or help influence, and pass it along. It's important that we talk about this stuff. And this is a great show and a great episode to listen to with some good information. So yeah, I highly recommend that you pass this along as well. So before we get into it, let's go to a word from our sponsors. Today's sponsor is Tallman Equipment. Tallman Equipment can be found at tallmanequipment.com or on social at Tallman Equipment. They have been super supporters of this show. I appreciate them so much. And let's just go to a quick word from Tallman.
Trust. It's hard to earn and easy to lose. That's why at Tallman Equipment Company, we work hard every day to do the right thing for our customers and everyone that puts their trust in us. Because at the end of the day, what really matters is who we help get the job done right and get back home. Trust. Tallman Equipment.
All right, there you have it. So along with that, I just want to say again that you can check out powerlinepodcast.com. There you'll find stickers, shirts. It's all for you guys. This show is all done in my spare time, outside of my regular day job, which is very involved as well, but super passionate about this show, about growing this show. So any support that you can show in, getting on there, purchasing these shirts or stickers. I know it seems like silly stuff, but it helps. It goes a long ways. And like I keep saying, the hats are coming with all this craziness in the world right now. I can't say when exactly the hats are going to show up, but they'll be here eventually. I'll get them on there as soon as I can and let you know on social. So get on there as well. Get on social, like, follow, comment, 5 stars. It helps push this show out, and let's grow this, guys. Let's pass this along to all the line workers or people in the line industry that you know. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into episode 30. Stoked for the show, guys. Stay safe. Peace. Okay, James Geering. I'm excited to talk to you again. This is awesome. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's kind of weird. I've done 3 or 4 podcasts on the other side of the microphone, and it's so strange because now I'm like, well, I want to ask the questions and I can just shut up and let you talk.
I've found it to be difficult on the other side of the microphone. I know I was on your show there and that seemed to go pretty good, but I've been in a couple other interviews as well, and it's strange. It's strange being the one on the other side. So I'm excited for this.
Yeah, this will be fun.
So I want to start this off by kind of setting up the scene. You are a fireman and firefighter and paramedic, as well as you have some other background in CrossFit and some things like that. And anyway, I'd like to kind of set the scene, get a little bit of your background and how you came to be in these, and then kind of work our way into a couple of topics that are both very relevant, both in the fire service and as well as for my audience, which is the linemen and the linewomen of the world, and both the physical and kind of mental side of things. So let's start off with, where are you from?
Originally from England, so Bath, which is about just under an hour from Stonehenge.
What was growing up in England like?
My childhood was amazing. So I grew up on a farm. My dad was a veterinarian. So I literally grew up, raising sheep and geese and ducks and helping him in surgeries. So it's funny, fast forwarding to this profession, I grew up around blood and guts. I grew up around a large family where the dinner table was basically the place where we would just make fun of each other, and many of the attributes that you get when you're in a profession like ours. But yeah, I mean, just when I look back, an amazing childhood.
I had a similar childhood, just not raised on a farm, but raised on acreage, and was just allowed to, drink from the garden hose. And mom and dad kicked us outside, and we would be outside. My brother and I'd be outside till dark every day, and it was a great way to grow up. Very fortunate. That's cool. So dad worked the farm. What kind of stuff did he do exactly? Just worked with horses, you said?
Yeah, so he was a horse vet, was his specialty, but we had a few small animal clinics too. So in there we do cats, dogs, some other more bizarre animals. I know he did a internship when he was a student vet out in Africa doing rhinos and elephants, and so. But I had him on the podcast. I forget what the number is now, but he's to this day is still passionate about all that stuff. So he's a perpetual learner, and I used to ride in his car and do visits to all these horse farms, and you meet just such a spectrum of people, from true like real life gypsies that are literally going from town to town, and all the way through to members of the extended royal family. So it was a really, really cool insight into humanity, and taught me basically what their philosophy was, which is there's two types of people in the world, nice people and assholes, and that's pretty much it. So skin color, sexual orientation, that's totally irrelevant. So it was I think a good upbringing to make you a decent human being.
Is being a vet something that you ever were wanting to become or wanting to do?
So funny enough, I wanted to be a doctor when I was little. I wanted to be basically three things. I wanted to be a pirate, a stuntman, and a doctor. And ironically, I ended up becoming all three in a sense. But when it came to the traditional educational route for being a doctor, I basically tripped at what we would think here as the community college level, with the higher level, physics and math classes. And I was like, okay, this isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
Like I get 2 + 2 is 4, nailed it. But past that, it gets a little more taxing. So that threw me off that medical side. And then the fireman side, I wanted to be a fireman, and I was told I was colorblind as a kid. And so I could never be a firefighter, never be a pilot. So the two true passions I wanted to do were taken off the table, as it were. And then it literally, very long story short, I had an epiphany, because I'm not the sharpest tool in the box, when I was mid-20s, that I'm not colorblind because I can see colors. That should have been the first clue. And so I basically challenged the medical, and the doctor was like, well, that's fine. You don't have to just see the book. You can just name things around the room and we'll call it good. So that was my entry into fire service, and then became a paramedic, which basically is a street doctor technically.
What was it like? How did you, so I often ask my guests how they found line work, because I'm always really intrigued by the different ways people find it. They either grew up with it, like myself, I'm second generation lineman, or they found it in the most random way. And I know the fire service is a little more relevant, and kids play with fire trucks as children, but how did you find it, or how did you know that was what you wanted to be?
So there were two events. One that I remember clearly, which is growing up on a farm. We had a couple of fires on the farm. We had one, our horse hospital actually caught fire, and there's another big one with this giant haystack that we had caught on fire too. So both of those, we have firemen on the farm, and I remember my mum would actually make soup and bring them out coffee, because it was now thinking about it as a fireman, they were both pretty drawn out scenes. So that was kind of on the conscious level one, but ironically, I'm writing a book at the moment. I was really having to kind of dredge through my past, and I had literally buried this in my mind, but I was in a house fire when I was, I think 4 or 5, and we almost died. Like, my sister luckily got us out, but so I'm sure
Wow.
subconsciously that was a part of it too. But I've literally, I mean, we're talking a few weeks ago, remembered that had happened, because I just had never really factored into my consciousness recently.
That's amazing. How did she get you out?
So it happened in the kitchen. My granddad was making chips, French fries.
Yeah.
And long story short, it got too hot, caused a fire in the kitchen. And he was off in his study, but he hadn't heard the commotion. He was older, and so she didn't know if he was in the house. So she kind of ran around the house, tried calling my mum from upstairs, and this is before cell phones and all that stuff. And she tried the door the first time, and it hadn't opened. But luckily, when she came back down, she must have turned it a different way, pulled on it, and was able to get it open. But by that point, the fire had extended all the way into pretty much where we were. So we were, from what I'm told, pretty covered in soot when they finally found us outside. We got given to a neighbor, so it scared the shit out of my parents, because they were told, oh, there's a fire in your parents' house, but don't worry, your grandfather's fine, or your father's fine. And she said, well, what about my children? And they were like, what children? So that scared them, I'm sure, but it all kind of found its way out eventually. About 30 minutes later, I think everyone realized that everyone was okay. But yeah, so, they talk about burying trauma. It's literally something I'd completely forgotten about, but that, I'm sure, was another contributing factor to down the road wanting to do the same thing that I saw these probably all men at that time doing on our farm and at my granddad's house.
Amazing. What does the process look like to become a fireman or get in the fire service?
So in England, it's civil service, so you start from scratch and you just go against a whole bunch of other regular citizens. But what's nice about in the US, I believe it's the same up with you as well, is you can either do that, and some departments will say, all right, we're looking for firefighters, we'll train you. But a lot of people in the States will actually put themselves through fire school. So you go to EMT school first, which is full-time. I think it's about 5 weeks. I did it part-time while I worked. And then fire school, again, is another, God, I don't know, I think it's 9 weeks full-time, I think. But I did it in, I don't know, 6 months, because, again, it was nights and weekends. So that gives you your basic fire EMT. So some parts of the country just need fire, I think, but down here in Florida and in California, you need your EMT as well. So that gives you the pieces of paper to walk through a door, along with like some vehicle driving classes and things. And then the next kind of step up really on the EMS side is paramedic, which is a full year over and above what you've already got.
Okay, I read as well on your bio there that you have a bachelor's in exercise physiology and kinesiology. When did this come into play? More recently, or was this back then as well?
So it was before and after. So I went to University of North London and did a 2-year degree, and then was at a crossroads when I was there. Ended up just leaving it at 2 years, and then literally 3-4 years ago, I got accepted to UF, and I finished my full bachelor's in University of Florida here.
Also read that you're a CrossFit coach. So has exercise and keeping like a healthy body been something that's always been a part of your life? Like, have you been an athlete your whole life, or?
Yeah. So I have. I've never been a phenomenal athlete as far as what you'd think of in your mind as an athlete, but the martial arts I got into my kind of mid-teens, ended up competing at a pretty high level. I won some British titles in different alleyways.
What
I say
type
that
of
because
martial arts?
Taekwondo was the main one.
Okay.
But even within that, you've got your belts, and then if you're fighting, you've also got your weights, and then there's different organizations. So it's kind of chopping it down. It's not like I was world champion or anything crazy like that. But yeah, so that really kind of opened the doors as far as understanding what you need to do as an athlete. And then that really carried over when I became a fireman, understanding along with the education side as well, the demands of what we call a tactical athlete, so police, fire, and obviously the military as well. And you guys as well. So when lives depend on your performance physically and mentally, that's a completely different job prerequisite than an accountant or a cashier. No disrespect to those professions, but when you're in what we do, if you are not in the right shape or the right mental state, then people die. So it's a very serious element of what we do.
I think that that's one of the things that I would like to get across to my audience in today's conversation is I don't believe that linemen keep themselves as physically fit as they should. And and then this is contributing to mental illness or mental health as well. But so you've always been uh, pretty much an athlete or in some sort of athletics and kept yourself in good physical shape. Uh, how old were you when you like started into the fire service?
I was 27 when I started, and I retired out a year and a half ago. So 44, I'm about to turn 46. So I had 14 years and 14 rough years and some pretty busy stations.
Sure.
So yeah, that's the other thing is I got in a little bit later. So my goal was to always be as good or if not better than the young guys, because it's about leading from the front, in my opinion. And I'm not the biggest guy either, so I wanted to be able to outwork the big strong guys too.
So being a young fire, well, an older fireman, but you really weren't that old. Like 27 still is fairly young. But what's it like um, being a young fireman compared to further along in your career and gaining that experience? I know for in the line trade, the young apprentices and the young linemen, there's a really kind of a sense of like, let's get after it. Let's tackle everything we can do. Kind of a bit of an invincibility to them. They just want to be up doing the dirtiest jobs. And is it similar in the fire service as well?
Yeah, and it's funny. I not trying to toot my own horn, but I never lost that. I really
Yeah.
didn't. I still wanted to be. I had no desire to promote. I constantly educated myself, but I wanted to be a better fireman, not a better paper pusher, not better at scheduling or any of that stuff. And there are people that are really good at that, but I love that part of it. But that's what you see is, yes, when we all first come on, most of us are like that. If you really got on the job for the right reason, you should be chomping at the bit to run calls. It's just the nature of the beast. But the job takes its toll. The shift work really takes its toll, and I see physically and mentally it does change some people. Some people are go-getters regardless, despite the working conditions, and they still go to all the conferences and take the trainings and keep themselves in shape and all that stuff. But it does take a toll, and I think as well the learning curve. I think it was Andy Stumpf, one of the Navy SEALs, and he said that they see a kind of the top of the curve begins at about 10 years. And that's kind of what I saw even in myself. And what that means is it's not that you think that you can't get better. You absolutely can get better, but you just learn a little less from each call. There's less that's new from every single, run that you go on. And I think that's a challenge as well. Is I think there's almost like a not boredom, but it's less challenging, it's less new, it's less exciting. Like if you've been on for 10 plus years and you go to a structure fire, it's got to be a pretty significant fire to even get you to call it as a fire. If it's just a bedroom fire, it's like, well, that wasn't even really a fire.
Sure.
Whereas when you were a rookie, you're like, oh my God, I
Yeah.
saved the day. And so there is that. But I think I love the way that you talked about the journeyman that you guys have in your profession, because I think that's something that's lacking as well. Is that a lot of our fire departments are very young now. Like I know the one I worked at 2 departments ago, I think something like 70% of their department has 5 years or less on the job.
Yeah.
So when you haven't got a bunch of veterans, and I was always yearning to learn from true senior firemen, but they become less and less of a thing because a lot of people promote, try and get up the ranks, try and get the pay bumps, and then the job takes its toll too. So it retires out a lot of our guys. But I think that's another thing where we see a kind of beginning of a drop off is you really need those senior people to keep teaching you and keep getting you fired up. And then, like I said, the shift work as well. So those two combined, I think, are why we see that difference. And some of my favorite mentors that I've had still have that burning passion and desire and work in the busy houses, but like you said, they're the old bull, not the young bull. You know what I mean? So they're the ones that will get off a fire engine, take a good 180-degree view of what they're looking at. The blinkers are off completely and make really great sound tactical decisions, and you follow them into anything. So I think that's who I always aspired to be, was the same passionate guy, but with less of the nervous energy.
I like what you said there, and I think that's completely relevant for us as linemen as well. We are seeing the same sort of thing where the older generation is starting to phase its way out, or they promote, they were moving to a management type role or a supervisory role or something like that. And I think it's important for the ones that are still out there and still very active in just being linemen to be leaders and to bring the younger generation up under them, up under their wing, so to say, and to really teach them, because that's one of the nice things about line work. It is a trade in most places, in most countries. It's an actual trade. So it requires an apprenticeship and a real on the job learning, similar to the fire service. Like, you can only learn so much from a book before you actually got to go get your hands dirty and get your hands on. So yeah, a lot of similarities there. What does training, like further training once you are firemen? What does training look like for you guys, and how much does the fire service invest back into the people that are there, as far as training goes, and on the job training or just further education?
Yeah, I think that's where there's a spectrum. Like I said, there are departments that are doing it very well. My California department, Anaheim, when I was there, we did a huge amount of training. It was awesome. And then the training mentality, training mindset within the crews. You'd go to the store to go buy some food for, a meal. And then while you were there, you'd walk around the back of the building and talk about how you'd force a door, where you'd lay hose, where you'd set the ladder to cut. So that mindset was awesome. But what I've seen conversely is the opposite, where there's the box checking mentality. And I'm assuming that, in professions where it's more of a, what's the right word? More of a business rather than, where an insurance policy, I guess, technically. There's probably more support. But what people don't realize is a lot of fire departments, again, they'll check the boxes in training. And then a lot of us that want to get better will have to take vacation days and then pay out of pocket to go and learn a skill that we can basically only use in the fire service. So it's literally dependent on which department you're in. There's some really good ones that will support very well and do a whole lot of training in the job itself. And there's many that there's very minimal. And if guys and girls really want to be good at what they do, they have to literally go to external fire academies to get their extra qualifications so they can function well when needed.
Yeah, it's similar in the line industry as well. It's too bad I keep encouraging the guys and girls to try to do that on their own, try to further educate themselves it's harder for the hands-on stuff, but just even for just the learning side, the education side, like listening to podcasts or reading books and doing even if it's just leadership education and things like that. I keep trying to get them to, go and do these things take the initiative themselves. Don't just sit back and wait for your union or the employer you work for to train you, to really be proactive in that, and to also push your employer, push your union, or push people above you to get you that training that you desire. Because I think it's important, but they're not just going to do it on their own. For the most part, they're not just going to come up with this stuff and train you because of costs and things like that. It's going to take people being proactive and pushing that, I think.
Yeah, and it's a middle road as well. I don't expect employers to provide every single bit of training. Of course, you're going to send yourself to conferences and stuff, but there's also, if you're going to ask first responders to go and respond to car wrecks and high angle rope rescues and all these different things that we do, and yet not give the training for that. That's where there's a lack of connection. So I think the middle road is absolutely right. The department should provide a good amount of training, but then the individual should be fired up enough to also look for other training themselves, even outside of their profession, which I think is something that you and I both are doing on a podcast. Is just because the fire service does it one way, it doesn't mean that, for example, the lineman industry isn't doing something that we could do even better.
Absolutely. No, I love that's one of the things about line work. It sounds like similar to the fire service. Like you've kind of worked around the country in different firehouses and different spots. Linemen are similar in that way, where they get to take and pack up. We call them tramp linemen, just pack up and move to a job on the other side of the country. And we could end up doing that several times in a year. Working myself, I worked in northern Alberta. A couple months later, I was in South Texas. And then a few months after that, I was back in British Columbia. Kind of in 1 year, seeing four to five provinces or states. So you really take what you've learned and get to pass that along to other people that you work with in these other areas. And that's one of the unique things about what we get to do, is really pass on that knowledge.
Yeah, and that's a good thing about traveling as well. I think there's a lot of ego sometimes in departments, yes. Especially, like neighboring departments. I think they're the best, and they do exactly the same calls as 3 feet across the city or county border than the other people do. But if you can have the humility to ask other counties, states, nations how they do it, you're going to realize, oh my goodness, that's actually a really good idea. We should use that ourselves.
Absolutely. What are some of you said you have traveled around. What were some areas, the firehouses that you did work in?
So basically, I started in South Florida, just by a place called Hialeah outside Miami. Then spent a few years in California in Anaheim, which is the city that protects Disneyland, but they're a separate city. Very, very good department. And then the last 10 years were in the Orlando area.
I imagine in these departments, you've obviously seen and been a part of many different array of situations. I read last night the blog that you wrote about distracted driving, and it's something. Distracted driving is really something that's been coming up a lot lately in a lot of ways. I know the company I work for just put a governor on all their vehicles. All their vehicles are electronically controlled, so they're now governing the speed. So different sorts of vehicles that they drive will not be able to go over a certain speed. Trying to restrict that, speeding and distracted driving. Maybe just talk about some of the things, like some of the situations that you have found yourself in. If you could maybe walk through a couple of these calls that you've been to, kind of set it up, some of the things that you've seen and been a part of.
Yeah, well, I think for first responders, you realize how many disasters in life were preventable, and that's why I wrote that blog, Man on the Curb, was just that. Like, if I think of all the fatal car wrecks I've been on, and there've been some pretty horrific ones, kids have been killed, and just awful things. They were all because someone wasn't paying attention, or they were drinking, or all the things that are legal and accepted, and not the marijuana or any of these things that have been demonized. And it's so backwards. But for example, let me see here. There was one horrific one where it was basically drug related, and then sleep deprivation because of that drug, and this car came off this freeway, and a man and a little girl were killed. And again, had that person been around different circumstances, maybe they were dealing with mental health problems with their addiction, we got to really reverse engineer a lot of these problems to societal issues. They wouldn't have fallen asleep at the wheel, and then that wouldn't have happened. That little girl would probably be 10, 12 years old now. And I think that's what's frustrating, is you see I've seen another one where a teenager, a really young kid that was driving, basically came onto a freeway way too fast, lost control, ended up sideways, and got T-boned by an SUV, and was killed outright just from that one momentary decision. And so I think I touch it on in that blog too. But as long as I've been in America, I came from England, and our driving tests were at least notoriously hard. Normally people would pass like second or third attempt, and you have to have a whole bunch of lessons. And if you've ever driven over in Europe, the roads are very narrow. It's very different, but the standard is very, very high, and it's tough shit. If you fail, you just take it again and again and again, so you can finally pass. And then when I came here, Florida specifically, I did a few maneuvers in the car park, and the guy goes, "Congratulations, you passed." And I'm like, "What do you mean I passed? We haven't even left the car park yet." So that was the difference. And that's one of my frustrations here is with prevention, is if you don't let someone behind the wheel until they truly have proven that they can operate that vehicle safely, God forbid, maybe even learn to use a blinker, not ride 12 feet from 6 feet from the car in front of them on the freeway. Some really basic rules. We lose 40,000 people in the US every year to fatal car accidents. So, with just some basic standards there, I think that we could really make an impact in that too. But the driving test has not changed, and I've been here 17 years now. So that's what's sickening, is when you see the opiate epidemic that we have. You see the effects of drink driving. I mean, all these preventable deaths, and especially things like obesity. We're freaking out about this damn coronavirus at the moment, yet we lose millions to obesity every year. And, that's not even talked about. We still feed our kids fast food and sodas in school. So, we get a very unique insight, which, as you can probably tell from some of my podcasts, makes me very angry when there's so much resistance to changing the way we do things.
Yeah. I bring this up, like, this is good for us to hear, because linemen spend a lot of time on the road. It's not like an office job where you're driving to a single place in the morning and you're staying there for your day and you work there and you come home. It's very transient. A lot of the time, I know when I last couple of years I spent in the field, I drove anywhere from 50 to 75,000 kilometers a year in a pickup truck. But this is something that we don't see, is the effects of when there is an accident, and what the damage it does to, families, and by, the deaths of their children, or whatever the situation is something that we don't see. So thanks for sharing that. I know I was hit by a drunk driver when I was 17 years old, doing highway speed. He was all over the road, and it was only a 2-lane road with steep ditches on either side. I had no options. I took his lane, and he came back into that lane and hit me head on. And thank God everyone survived, including him. But it really made me think differently about seatbelts and, driving impaired and driving distracted. I'm not saying I'm not guilty for driving distracted every once in a while. It's definitely something a person has to work on. But it's good to, stop and think about these things once in a while.
Yeah. And just to be, completely transparent, I can remember one time I had a little Mini, like Mr. Bean Mini, when I was young, and driving like a little douchebag myself. I mean, I used to drive pretty carefully normally, but I had a idiotic moment and try to pass someone, and it would have been a head-on there, but probably 30 mile an hour each way, which still would have added to 60. But in a Mini's like a tin can. I would have been killed outright. So even when overall generally you're sensible, if you're in a group with a bunch of guys that are cheering you on, or you're angry because you just found out your wife cheated on you, whatever it is, it just takes that split second to take one or multiple lives.
Yeah. One other thing I want to talk to you about was kind of the ergonomics of the profession. I know probably very similar in the fire service and the paramedics. you get yourselves in like your own body into very awkward positions where you're doing, lifting, or for you guys, I'm sure you have to like even getting on your knees even at a scene with somebody in front of you and being there for probably hours at a time, and just the effects that this has on the body. And I know that you've talked about in your podcast before a bit of your story and having injuries for linemen and linewomen as well. Back problems, knee problems, neck problems, elbows, like you name it. We suffer from it because we're often, when you climb a pole, and you lift things and you turn, and you're just like, you're in a very awkward situations using muscles in your body that aren't really supposed to be used for what you're doing it for. So it ends up by the end of your career, you feel very broken. So maybe just walk me through what your injuries were. And I want to get into talking about some things that you've done to heal and recover from those.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think the first most important thing is to underline as well. When first responders are, working 10, 20, 30 years, that's every third day they're not sleeping. If you're on a schedule that most of us are on, which is creating a huge amount of mental and physical ill health. And you'll hear, I don't know if it's kind of common in your profession as well, but you'll hear some of the basically dickheads in the stations will roll their eyes when one of the guys gets hurt. So, oh, it's always the fit guys that get hurt. And it is. But the reason is because they're taking the job seriously, they're training, they're working out. But when you're not sleeping, that's when your muscles, your ligaments, your tendon, I mean, everything is repairing, your brain, everything. So when you take away that ability to recover, that really does set them up for failure, which is why we see a huge amount of injuries. I don't think it's from, they talk things like repetitively stepping off the fire engine. Well, realistically, you're stepping off on a busy day, busy day, maybe 20 times, stepping down, stepping up. That's not on its own, gonna cause issues. But if you are and then not recovering and repairing, then that's different. So the injuries I had, though, I had absolute straw that broke the camel's back injury, where was absolutely fine, picked up this patient on a stretcher. It was my size, like 165 pounds. And yeah, Murphy's Law, it wasn't an emergency at all. It was a panic attack. And just kind of arched my back to try and get the wheels over the back of the ambulance, and felt a pop, and it was horrendous. I managed to drive to the hospital. I was driving that day, but then when we got there, I was like, all right, I need to, go see someone after I get back. And I tore a bunch of ligaments in my back. It was like L4, 5, 6, and had bulges and all that stuff. But what was amazing is that the workman's comp response was a bunch of drugs and then surgery. That's pretty much what they throw at you. And so I was like, well, that's not going to happen, either of those. So I went immediately and aggressively pursued the PT, and then paid out of pocket for chiro. And then while I was at the chiropractor, I discovered this thing called foundation training, which is this amazing system that was not even system, movement practice that was created by a chiropractor in California who jacked up his own back. And it looks almost like yoga, but the duration of these practices are literally 10, 15 minutes. They're so short, but it basically corrects the imbalances that we get, especially from things like sitting and just not moving in modern day life. And I was blown away how quickly I healed, to the point where I went back to work, and then I even did like a charity firefighter competition about 3 or 4 months later, and was deadlifting 225 for reps, which for me is quite heavy. I'm not a big boy. So it wasn't just like, oh, I'm out of pain. It was like, okay, I'm functioning really well again. But then as far as wear and tear, I actually, this is all in one fire department, so I'm sure they hate me because I cost them a fortune. But both of my meniscus tore within about 2 years of each other as well. So that was another thing where I had to, rehab, and got back to work with those. But I think it's understanding, this is my opinion, and I've certainly asked many of the experts in fitness and health and rehab. if you don't have the ability to recover, you literally are breaking it down. However, if, for example, I can convince my profession that the work week is destroying our first responders, and a shorter work week, i.e. 42 hours a week, would be so beneficial for longevity. When you understand that, I think you can, perform a lot longer doing this job. But if you're burning the candle at both ends, you are physically going to break. It's not if, it's when.
It's very, very similar for us. We don't have quite the sleep deprivation issue that you guys do, but just the fatigue in itself with such long days, it probably actually does lead to some sort of sleep deprivation, not getting the amount or the quality of sleep that we need every night. I've never actually thought about it that way, but we'll quite often work, like on major projects, work 10 to 16 plus hours a day. And it's very physically demanding. Oftentimes, especially up here in the north, through the winter, just even being out in the cold all day, every day, really wears you down. And I remember one guy, when you start a shift, or I'm sure it's the same for you guys, when you start a shift or start a job and you're fresh and you're healthy, like you'll bend down, say, to pick up a generator or something heavy, and you're using your knees and you're bending down properly and you're lifting right, or but further along as the shift progresses or as the job progresses and your fatigue progresses, maybe you're twisting and grabbing that generator with one hand, grabbing it from an awkward position. You're not focusing on doing it correctly. And I know that that's been the cause of a lot of injuries for us. So this is a good conversation. I like the sounds of this foundation training. I know that you've had so many other amazing guests on your show already. Like one that comes to mind is like Mike Salemi or Bledsoe, or these guys that talk about these different things that they can do to strengthen their core, like steel mace or kettlebells or things like that. Do you have any other kind of things that you've tried or suggestions for my listeners from things that your listeners have given you that they could use or dive into?
Yeah, well, I think for what I do, and probably very similar for you guys too, what I really love is, I think CrossFit is great, but as far as the tactical athlete functional fitness, I love kettlebells, the sandbags without the handles, like strongman sandbags, sleds, so pushing and pulling sleds. You've got the 50-foot rope, 100-foot rope that you pull the sled to you on. Those kind of real world movements, I think, really do kind of get rid of those weak links, because you're asking the body to do exactly what it's supposed to do. I like stairs. I mean, the stairs, whether it's actual, concrete stairs or whether it's a hill, you guys obviously ascend a huge amount too on poles. So I think that from a strength point of view is really good. Yeah, barbells are great, but I think that squatting, for example, with a sandbag is so much more real world than sticking a bar on your shoulders. But then I think another thing for anyone listening who's older than 16, which is I'm assuming everyone, is the mobility side. And not flexibility, not trying to do splits between two chairs anymore, but we're really understanding keeping those planes of motion in good form, and then getting the symmetry in the muscles. So trying to get as much muscular balance as you can, because I think that's why a lot of us break when we're a little bit older, is we lose that mobility. I just did this new stunt job that I'm doing, and in the audition process, I kicked the way that 21-year-old James kicked, and I felt my hamstring tear. I didn't show him in the audition. I got through it, but yeah, I totally pulled a hamstring pretty hard. And that's the thing. There's no difference in my ability other than the mobility of that muscle. So that's what I'm realizing now. My 2020 has been, my goals are purely gymnastics and mobility. And when I say gymnastics, things like muscle ups and handstands and things, basic movements, but asking my body to do things that a younger person can. So I would say that. I mean, Mike and the two Mikes that you mentioned are great. Julian Pinot is the strong fit guy. I've had strong first kettlebell people. I mean, all kinds of people, strong men. And yeah, I mean, that's it. If it mirrors what you do at work, you're probably on the right road. But if there's no mobility concept, again, I think you're setting yourself up for failure.
It's great. It's great advice. You're 100% right. We do a lot of the movements you talked about, like pulling the sled towards yourself. In our world, like it sounds funny, pull your wire, but we pull wire, and often from awkward positions. Like I said, you'll be on a pole, so you'll be leaning to the side and backwards, and you're yanking on this piece of wire trying to pull it up and clip it or dead end it. And so that can quite often, same sort of things, like like you said, mimicking those real world conditions is a good thing.
And even performance too. So say, it takes you normally, I mean, I'm pulling a number out my rear end, but say it takes 10 minutes to get the cable where you need it to be. Well, you'll find when you're doing this kind of stuff that you get it done in 7 because you're not fatiguing anymore. So there's that, injury prevention element, but there's also that performance element where you get better at your job, full stop.
100%. I know this job, trauma comes in many forms. I understand. And for linemen, some of them have seen some very traumatic things at work. Maybe they've been involved with a fatality or a major incident, which it happens more often than we want to really talk about. And we need to start changing that as well. But for us, it's probably more over the course of a long period of time. But for you guys, I know in the first responder community, I know you've seen some incredibly hard things, whether it's those kids that you talk about that have perished from car accidents or some of the fire situations that you've been a part of. For linemen, we come from this rough and tough background, like we talked a little bit before the show on. I know similar for the fire service, I'm assuming. How do you kind of get around this, or how have you got around this? Like trying to push past this rough, tough attitude. Like, I don't know, give some advice on that.
Yeah, well, firstly, I want to make sure, and we did this last time we had our conversation. When you speak about that, we lost a lineman in my town here, Timmy Beard, back in 2012. So, yeah, I mean, I know you guys have a lot of line of duty deaths, which are, awful. And then, I'm sure that you probably respond to disaster, some of the things that your peers see in these tornadoes and hurricanes and other things that you respond to try and get people their power back. And I'm sure that you witness some horrendous things there too. To me, it honestly is educating people to how we, especially men, define what a man was. So through the podcast, as you know, I've had loads of people on who I think are, an alpha male, whether it's Navy SEALs, Green Berets, SWAT medics. I mean, all these different manly men who talk about the trauma they've seen, how it crushed them at one point, So I think that's a big part of it, but also going back to manliness, and we really fall back on Hollywood. So a man was Rambo or Terminator or Predator, you know what I mean? These bodybuilders that popped up in the 70s and 80s. And people talk about John Wayne too. Well, John Wayne never fucking served. John Wayne didn't really do a whole lot for other people. I mean, no disrespect to the John Wayne fans out there. But what really kind of underlines it to me is that if you watch a Band of Brothers, and the real men of the 101st are talking at the beginning and the end of each of those episodes, and a lot of times they're welling up with tears because of what they saw and losing their friends. That's a man. That's some of the most heroic people on this planet, and they're in tears. So the way I try and do it is obviously present now, tens and tens and tens of stories of these amazing people pouring their heart out, saying, no, that's complete crap. I'm a Navy SEAL and this is what crushed me. But the other thing, people are kind of getting them to look back at where they got this version of a man from in the first place, and it's complete Hollywood bullshit. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. Real men it's a yin and yang. And real women, we have the soft and the hard, you know. And if you're a first responder, for example, then you're a compassionate person. You said, I will put my life on the line for a complete stranger. So then to walk around beating your chest, you know, is a complete, you know, farce. You're not even being true to yourself. You are caring and compassionate. So if you can be caring and compassionate for strangers, you have to own that compassion towards yourself as well. So shoving all those emotions down, we've seen, has done nothing but, you know, created grieving families as they buried their loved one. So that's really the message I'm trying to get, you know, men and women to understand, is what we were sold was wrong. What we were sold, the way we eat was wrong. The way we farm, you know, I mean, there's this thing now where everyone's wearing these suits for coronavirus. And I pointed out the other day, like, you know, they wear the same suits to spray your food that you feed your children. You know what I mean? So we're just in this insane place from so many, where you and I grew up, and with there's some really great discussion that's kind of reverse engineering to the point where they realize, okay, this was just wrong at this point. So I'm hoping that that's the kind of philosophy that's going to get people questioning that thing. And I've seen definitely in the fire service that this is really starting to get hold now. I'm in the echo chamber, so I don't know if this is, you know, all over the country or all over the world, but I see more and more people are seeing that, you know, we're supposed to be a brotherhood and a sisterhood. Well, that means you take care of each other, not shame people because you think they're being weak.
Yeah. I found that people are they're very quick to do that. I know I heard your episode with Travis Howes, and that's very much what just like the fire service or living in a firehouse is just the similar way as working on a crew. Like, people will, if there's any hint at weakness, people will hone in on that, and the guys will hone in on that. And it's just a source of picking you apart almost, right? It's something to tease, bug, poke at. But I agree with you. Like, that's all fun. That's fine. We can be like that. And I don't think that we should lose that, because that's part of what makes us tight. A little bit of poking around, a little bit of fun like that. But in the same sense, like, I think that we need to take it on ourselves to come up alongside somebody if we see them struggling, or if we notice them struggling, and sincerely ask them if they need help or if they'd like to talk, but with some sense of sincerity. I know that for myself, like, I've never really struggled deeply with mental health. It's just, I had a fantastic childhood and so on. So I don't have that deep trauma that a lot of people have, but I see it in my industry. And I think that we need to come up alongside these people and be okay with having these conversations, because it is okay to talk. And I don't know if you think the same way. Sounds like.
Oh, did I lose you?
Yeah, you there?
Oh, I got you back now. Yeah. No, so I agree completely, and you hit on a very good point. I personally have always dealt well, and I've been through some, not so much trauma wise. I mean, I think every first responder sees a lot of the stuff, but I've had times where I was on shift going through a divorce as a single dad, also in paramedic school. Like, I mean, you talk about an ass kicking. I was under it, and I got, you know, down. I was really fucking low. I would cry, you know, when my little boy had gone to bed, I'd sit there in the house on my own and cry. But I never went to a dark place, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So when this started coming, you know, to fruition, or the awareness started coming, it was two schools of thought to me. You know, you've got the people who are hurting, and that's the ones that, you know, we need to encourage to reach out and ask for help and let us know they're hurting. But then you've got the people who are genuinely doing well. Well, good for you. So share what it is that you do that enables you to do well. And also, because you're doing well, look around and see who needs help. You know, that's the other side of the coin. It's like being the fit guy that shames the fat guy. Yeah. You don't shame the fat guy. You're like, hey, I'm going to go work out. You want to come with me? We're going to start super slow. You know, I'm going to show you some stuff. You know, let's start, you know, let's just go for a walk, whatever. That's what you need to do in the mental health space. I think that, you know, this shaming, usually the shaming came from people that actually were really hurting anyway themselves. But if you're doing well, that's what I always tell people. there are many things that people do well that enable them to, it's exercise, it's having that tribe, that community, inside of work, outside of work. Obviously the family dynamic is a big important thing. Are you abusing alcohol, or are you actually lucky enough not to have any kind of addiction crutches? All those factor in. So that's what I tell people is, if you have found things that work for you, share that. Be vulnerable. Don't be like, I've never had a bad day ever. Start with a story. Like, okay, here was a really shitty day where, I found out my wife was doing this, or my kid, got sick or whatever. But here's what I did. I hiked up this mountain. I did whatever. And I think that we need to educate is everyone in that lineman crew, everyone in that fire station, that police station has an opportunity to make a difference, whether they're going through pain and make a difference by saying, I need help, which is a huge step, or I'm doing really well, how can I help?
I think that a lot of people, similar for me, 3 years through a separation, heading to divorce, and I've noticed, other than one or two people that have really been key individuals, being there for me, helping me get through that, a lot of people just like to kind of, they're afraid to be vulnerable. They're afraid to come up to you and ask you how you're doing, or take you out for dinner or something, to try to talk about this stuff. I don't know what it is, but a lot of people just are almost afraid of that. They'll come up and say, the typical, hey, how you doing? Oh yeah, I'm fine. Nice, go about their day, instead of really wanting to dive deep with you. So that's what I'm trying to get across to these guys out there, especially the linemen that are tight, just like a firehouse. They work with these crews, the same crew, quite often, day in and day out. If they're seeing one of their crewmates, or their brothers or sisters struggling, to come up alongside them and be the bigger person, and be vulnerable, and take that on. So that's important to move past this, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a caveat to that, I know from experience, like I've sat through mental health lectures, and they're informative, and it's interesting, but they don't grab you. They don't make you go, I'm going to change, or I'm going to reach out, whatever. But when I've had these stories on the podcast, or I've listened to other podcasts, I know those people that are on, after they did the podcast, they're like, oh my God, when I went back to the station, people started coming out of the woodwork talking to me. And what's happened is they were vulnerable, and they told their story. And then people around the world, literally, are like, well, shit, that's exactly how I feel. But I thought I was being a pussy. I thought I was being weak. I thought I was whatever. And so I think that you have to be vulnerable. All of us have a story. Many of us have many, many, many stories of where we felt weak, where we felt at the end of our rope, whatever it was. And that's a great way to open that dialogue. Ask, are you okay? That it's easy to get brushed off. No, are you really okay? And if you think there's something there, be like, all right, well, let me tell you, I had a really shitty day the other day. And then that's opening the door then for them to then respond with, oh, okay, here's what's going on here. But I think people are afraid. They paint this worst case in their mind. Oh, what if they tell me something I can't handle? Chances of that are probably slim. But if they do, well, then that's when you go, ask for someone else for support and help. And, what do I do? But if you don't ask, that's how we find out that one of our own has taken their own lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there, and if there isn't, no worries, but is there anything from some of the other guests that you've had on, anything else that kind of comes to mind of things that would help somebody that maybe is struggling, even coming out and saying, I need help, if it's not that, or something they can kind of do on their own, or books they can read, or people they can talk to, or something else out there that maybe I don't know about, that maybe one of your guests has shared with you that you could share with us?
Yeah, I mean, for a book, I think a great one is one called Tribe by Sebastian Junger. Very, very short books, like 130 pages. He wrote The Perfect Storm, the one they made into a movie, and he did the documentary Restrepo. He was actually embedded a journalist in Afghanistan himself. But just an amazing insight into why we need to be part of a group. So I think that from an aha moment was huge. I had 2 episodes with him, 2 interviews with him. The podcast is a great resource. You hear so many people from all walks of life talking about that. I think that another area that is the elephant in the room is addiction. Like for when you look in the mirror and you're relying, we think of addiction, we think of drugs, and it may be alcohol, which is the true elephant in the room. If you're constantly kind of dulling out the rest of the day by drinking, that's a huge red flag. And then as far as resources, that's the problem. There isn't like an organized structure. Yeah. So really it's a case of whether you're hurting or whether you're doing okay at the moment, start looking around and finding some.
Lost you for a second there, James.
Yeah, sorry, mate. My son called in. Let me make sure that's turned off. In our profession, we need to make sure that we have counselors that understand what we do and see as well. I don't know if that would be as much of an issue because you guys aren't exposed to horrible stuff all the time, but understanding there's different types of counselors, but finding someone to connect with, like even if you're doing well, do like a wellness, find a counselor that you would feel comfortable talking about, and just begin that relationship. And if you're not doing so well, definitely find a counselor that you feel comfortable with, because when you're really hurting, it's not the time then to suddenly be looking around. But that's a big thing for me, is the counseling seems to be obviously huge when you find the right person. There's different things like equine therapy and canine therapy, where you around horses or dogs. There's a thing called EMDR, which is amazing for trauma, but you do not want to be trying to sift through our nightmarish, it's different up there, but the US system with healthcare, they in my network and all this stuff, when you might be in some sort of crisis. So that would be a couple of things. The podcast, like I said, has so many episodes on mental health that would be a great listen for people. Tribe is a great read. And then, really it's finding local groups that you can establish a relationship with now before, you're maybe in a place where you're not able to think straight anymore.
Perfect. Thank you. I know that you are a father as well. I have 3 children, and so I was kind of wondering. I know that you've gone through some struggles recently with your son. I don't know how much you want to share about that, but like as far as talking about some of this stuff with your children, whether it's physical or mental health, how do you go about approaching your kids with some of these things? Is there some tools or tips or tricks that you could share with us on how to talk to your kids about? I know I've always kind of really struggled breaking through, trying to talk to my kids, because kids can be difficult to talk to about these sorts of things. So what are some things that you do to talk to your son about this stuff?
Well, it's been a little bit different journey, because sadly he's been around it for a while. So my wife now, Becky, she lost her boyfriend before me to suicide. So kind of early on, he was exposed to kind of understanding that a little bit, because it was in discussion sometimes. And then when I started this, and a little time before, we lost firefighters and police officers locally to suicide. So it's kind of in this household probably talked about a lot more than other areas. And what's interesting is then when he gets mental health talks at school, he'll come home and be like, Daddy, some of the stuff they're telling us is wrong. You know what I mean? Because he's been around all these like top psychologists and psychiatrists through discussions on the phone for these people I had on the show. But honestly, it's about communication. So it doesn't matter if it's my 12-year-old or one of your fellow linemen. It's creating an environment where they feel they can tell you anything. Because if there's any shame in depression, anxiety, and God forbid suicidal thoughts, it's going to stop them from reaching out. So really that's been it as far as mental health. I raised my son on the kind of philosophy of gratitude and kindness. It's pretty much the nucleus of everything. And so
beautiful.
Around that kind of arena, I think there has to be, an open communication to be nice to each other and other people. But that obviously there's that self-kindness too. So I think, rather than delving too deep, because one of the bad sides of what I do is he's been exposed to a lot of talks of suicide and depression. I think that's even one of the reasons why he had some of the issues over the new year, was when he felt hurt and sad, he used words like depressed and kill myself. And he didn't actually mean that, so there was like almost too much exposure to it. So we had to kind of have discussions about pulling that back, because these days you say the wrong thing, you literally can end up as a child in a psychiatric ward for 3 days. So that would be it. But I don't think it's any different with kids and adults, really. It's if they feel they can tell you how they're feeling, then you can be aware of some negative mental places well before it gets to a bad place, because I think it only gets there in most people because it's a constant growth of these negative feelings, but they feel like they can't offload it to someone.
That's beautiful. Thanks. I want to talk a little bit about your podcast now before we get to a couple closers here. Because I know it's the East Coast you're on right now, so it's late, and I appreciate your time. So you were obviously in the fire service and EMS world for 15 years, was it?
Yeah, well, 14 technically. Yeah.
14. And so I'm just curious, what was your reasoning or motivation for starting the podcast, and talk about Behind the Shield a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's a very kind of quick and easy story. About 2 years before I started the podcast, we had a spate of first responder deaths, and I went to funeral after funeral after funeral, and it was a variety of things and none of them were, none of the fire ones were job related as far as like killed in a fire. It was all health issues. So it was cancer, heart disease, autoimmune disease. There was a suicide, overdose. I mean, just a gamut. And then there were also some officer involved shootings where the officers were killed. And so I really went online to find, I love podcasts. I'm like, well, let me find some good podcasts on firefighter or first responder health that I can start listening to and I can share and find some answers. And there really weren't any, especially in the firefighter space. And so it was one of those things where I was like, all right, well, that's a sign then that I have to be the one that starts it. So about 3.5 years ago now, I kind of researched a little bit on how to do one, and I listened to Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss and Barbell Shrugged. And there was a police one, the Squad Room, Gary Tisla, I had on the show, and they were kind of my model of my version of the firefighter angle of what they did. And that was it. I just wrote to a bunch of people, and it was funny because I wrote kind of like the old salesman that I did in London years and years ago. 1 in 10 will say yes. So I was like, all right, well, let me send about 10 emails and try and get my first guest. Well, basically everyone said yes. So I was like, oh shit. Okay. Fantastic. But and it was because they realized that, it was just like you're doing to make the world better. It wasn't for, self-promotion or financial reasons. It was just to bring their information to the world. So that was it really. And now we're almost at 300 episodes, 3.5 years later.
That's amazing.
And yeah, and what I love is when you look at the metrics, it's literally global. I'm sure yours is the same, where, there are people that listen in South Africa and, India and all these crazy places. And they may not have access to the information that we have, but you put a podcast in cyberspace, and someone with an internet connection in, Mumbai can learn from a Navy SEAL in San Diego. So I love it. I think podcasting is amazing.
It does. It blows my mind actually when I do look at those metrics and I hover over some of those countries and I'm like, wow, there's 4 people in this country listening to this. Like, what? Really?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. I mean, what kind of education do linemen have in Bangkok? You know what I mean? It may be amazing. It may be stuff and I'm sure there are things that you could learn from and vice versa. So my goal ultimately is to have a very, very international list of guests, but that obviously requires, more money to be able to travel, because I want to do a lot more face to face. But yeah, I mean, this giant rock that we're living on, has just so many people that have got so many great ideas, and I think podcasting is really circumnavigating the bullshit filters and barriers that so many media outlets and even employers have put up that have stifled us getting good information.
I heard Rogan talk about it once before. Somebody was getting negative on the show, talking about how are they putting it? They're talking about the world kind of heading towards more of a negative space, and Joe's quite an optimist, like a human optimist. He's very optimistic about humanity, and he brought up. He said, "Well, just wait till these people in these developing nations and developing countries have the internet." Like, he's like, a lot of these places don't have it. They've never had the ability to sit and listen to podcasts and listen to 4 hours of conversation about different religious beliefs or whatever the subject may be. And just imagine what these people are going to learn when they have this ability. And he's like, you can see it starting to happen, and that's only going to make us all better and make the understanding of things better. And I thought that was really well put, the way he put it. And it's so true, how just like we were talking about linemen or firemen traveling around North America, teaching other people in the states and provinces they work in different things that they've learned. Well, now the ability to take that global is just that much more exciting to me through podcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's great about it. And this is the same with Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan and all these other guys, is it's free too.
Yeah.
And that's the beautiful thing about this is, right now I'm kind of at the precipice of sponsorship where, right, this coronavirus definitely didn't help at all. But where I'm almost to the point where I can match what I used to earn, which wasn't a huge amount as a fireman either, but to pay the bills. But the people listening just get this free content, and then the podcast, and matching them with what I do now, which is a great sponsor. So I've got 511 Tactical, which are amazing. It's like this synchronistic win-win-win relationship where the entire world gets free content, and then they're also introduced to companies that are actually worth buying from.
Yeah, very much so. It's cool. What are some things that you've learned from the people on your show that maybe you've started to adapt to your life now, if you have any kind of off the top of your head?
Oh my God, the list is huge.
I imagine it's
Really
massive.
is. Yeah, so the absolute first jaw-dropping thing for me was Kirk Parsley, who's a Navy SEAL, who basically educated me on sleep deprivation. He was on Barbell Shrugged as one of their guests. That was huge. Understanding as a shift worker, period, anyone who works, past sundown, understanding circadian rhythms and the short-term cognitive dangers of sleep deprivation, the long-term horrendous effects of sleep deprivation was massive. So it reprogrammed the way I did my sleep hygiene, took my sleep a lot more seriously. He actually has a thing called Sleep Remedy, which for anyone that struggles with sleep, it is amazing, absolutely amazing. There's Navy SEALs that he worked with that were all on Ambien, and he became their doctor after he left the SEAL teams. He went to med school and came back, and he put this together. And several of the SEALs I had on the show were like, "Yeah, that stuff was incredible." So that it's called Doc Parsley Sleep Remedy. Highly recommend it. And then the CBD stuff, when I got into that arena and cannabis medicine, not eating people. That was a life changer too. And I've been on CBD now for a long time. I can't swear by it enough. And again, if you choose one that's 0 THC, it's completely safe for any workplace drug tests, contrary to, the big pharma's bid to try and get rid of CBD, because it's basically destroying their billions and billions that they're making. And then, Strong Fit, Julian Pinot changed the way I exercise with all the strongman movements, the foundation training I do pretty much every day and my back has been amazing ever since I hurt it. So I mean, literally the list goes on. Headspace is a great app for mental practice. 10-minute guided meditation you just do in your phone. So yeah, I mean, there's so many answers in the world, and sadly, when you turn on the TV, it's obnoxious sports stars beating their chest because they stuck a ball in the hole, or Kardashians and Biebers. So if you turn that off and listen to whoever, a good podcast, you will find so many life-changing philosophies and people out there. It's incredible.
Well, hopefully people start listening to podcasts now that they have no sports to watch except for bowling.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was hoping that I might be able to snag some of my potential guests, because they're all going to be quarantined at home. It'd be a perfect time for some Skype interviews.
Totally. Actually, that's a good plan. Okay, James. So a couple of closing questions I thought would be kind of cool is, I have listened to your show for probably the last couple of years now. And when like I said, when I was on your podcast, I didn't know where to start when starting a podcast. I had no idea. I know that it was something I wanted to do, but I didn't know what kind of gear to use, what kind of programming. I didn't know any of it. So I turned to YouTube and other podcasts to try to figure out how to do it. And I know that I'd only listened to a handful of different shows, just, a year or two ago, and yours was one of them that I found, because just like everything that you just described, it was really relatable. It's really, I think that I know some of the linemen that I've talked to that I've now got listening to your show, the feedback is that it's very relatable content to them and their lives, because fire service and line service is very similar in that way. So I thought it would be kind of cool to flip the script and ask you back the same sort of questions that you ask. So James, what kind of book, because these are questions that you ask at the end of your show every time. And so I imagine that you have a pretty large library of answers to these questions. So do you have a book that you could recommend? I know you've recommended Tribe already by Sebastian Junger. Do you have another book that you could recommend my audience?
Yeah, and you're right. I'm looking at such a giant library now, and I wasn't a reader till I started the podcast. And now if I have someone that's written a book, I try and read or listen to their book before, doing an interview. So I've come from like barely reading to like a book a week. So one that isn't as well known that I really, really think is incredible, and we touched on the mental health side, it's called The Beauty of a Darker Soul, and it's by Josh Mance. And again, he was a member of the military with just such a powerful story of resilience. So dealing with what he did and then realizing how that could actually, create a stronger mind, but a very, very powerful story. So that's another one I love. And then I think, I'm sure a lot of people know this book, but Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He was in one of the concentration camps, and he was actually a psychiatrist, I think, prior to being taken. So his perception of the experience and still showing gratitude and awe in each day, despite the horrific conditions they were in, is to me such a great recalibration of daily life.
Amazing. Thanks. Do you have a favorite movie?
I do. I have lots. I think Shawshank Redemption is one of my favorites.
Awesome.
It was amazing. The Green Mile, another one. I don't know what it is about prisons, but
That's about 12 hours of watching right there.
Yes. And then The Power of One, another great movie. That's Morgan Freeman as well, I think. And then the Band of Brothers series. It's mentioned so many times by other guests on my podcast, and I couldn't agree more. I don't think I've seen any other show so many times that I've seen that. I think I've watched it 4 or 5 times now. Absolutely. And it just blows me away every time.
One of my sons is a huge World War II buff, almost a historian now, how much he knows about it. It's crazy. And we really enjoy watching that together, that series. We've seen it a couple of times together. Do you have a favorite documentary?
Um, Let me see. I like the Vice series. I learned about the Norwegian prison system from Vice. There's a guy I've been trying, oh my God, so long now to get on. And it's just he's part of the NHS in England. But they're talking about the knife crimes, and so that's a really good, it's not so much documentary, more of a kind of longer news story type thing. But they're really good. And I talk about this quite a bit. 13th is a great look at slavery into the American prison system. And when you watch it, your first reaction is like, nah, that's a little extreme. And then you kind of get into it and you see this profit-based prison system that we have now. And just to give us like a mind-blowing statistic, in 1970s we had 350,000 prisoners in the US. Now we have 2.4 million.
What?
So yes, so it's something that the average person, if you haven't really been the wrong side of the law, doesn't really think about. But we have a profit-based system where people make money from a full prison. So the same way as our drug, uh, the drug companies make a fortune off sick people, not well people or dead people. There are some pretty jacked up, secrets behind some of these things. And the reason why I'm so into that is because it's prevention again. The goal to make the streets safer for our police officers and medics and firefighters is to reduce the number of criminals, but if we have the system that's creating more and more and more and locking up people for ridiculous things like marijuana and prostitution and things that are completely legal and therefore a lot safer in other countries, that's something that that we really need to do. And I had a Norwegian prison governor on the show, Tom Eberhardt from Bastøy prison, and just a completely different system, and their reoffender rate is like 10% or something. It's so low. So yeah, that's a great one to educate yourself on that particular area.
Amazing. What do you do to decompress?
So yeah, good question. I do, the foundation training has got slightly kind of a mental element to it as well. I like to blow off steam working out, but as you probably heard me talk with some of the guests on the show, you got to be careful with exercise that you don't make it worse. So as a first responder, say we have a bad shift, I used to go in and just kill myself in the gym, and that actually adds to stress. So one thing that I do on my normal routine now is I take my dog for a walk around this community that we live in, which is beautiful. It's like a 2-mile walk, and then leave my phone at the house too. So it's not a specific meditation, but I'm left alone with my thoughts rather than looking at a device. So that's a big one, and I love the beach too. There's something about the ocean, especially on the East Coast here with the waves, that is just so therapeutic.
Fantastic. Do you have a person that you could recommend for me in this show?
God, there's so many. There's so many. With the linemen specifically, I mean, it would depend on which field again. I would say, rather than someone I know, is there anyone that you know of in the lineman industry that is out there talking about maybe some near suicidal or mental health story that they have? Because I know with the firefighters, what really is resonating with them is it's the associated professions. So let's say it's some male ballet dancer. I mean this in no disrespect at all, and he talks about how he was in crisis. Well, some people are going to roll their eyes and be like, well, of course he is, he's a male ballet dancer. But if you've got a Green Beret Army Ranger saying it just reframes it. And is that right? No, but that's just the way it is. So I would think that someone who's been through some sort of trauma, mentally, physically, or both, in your profession, that maybe is even out there, doing talks about it, would really, really buy in, because it would be apples to apples then.
Fantastic. Okay, you mentioned that you are writing a book now. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Painfully slowly, yes. It's like 50-60% written, and I've just kind of hit a wall. But I think, ironically, that maybe this thing we're going through at the moment might help me get back on the computer and write some more. But the goal is ultimately it's going to be anecdotes from my career specifically, along with kind of lessons learned that I hope, if it's written the way I want it to write, it'll be a super easy read, but it will, again, create that buy-in where the story kind of illustrates why a certain area is important. So I have a title of mine. I don't want to say it publicly because,
Sure.
I want to do it when it's released. And my goal is to get it out by the summer, though. So I will definitely let you know.
Fantastic.
But it will be like, basically the health of the world in general through a first responder's eyes.
Brilliant. I love it. Where can people find you?
So it's really cool. If you Google James Geering about 4 years ago, you'd find an Australian drug dealer and then a pedophile in England. So thank God this James Geering, I was neither of those, just to be clear. Now, if you Google, it'll bring up all the stuff. But the website for everything is jamesgeering.com, JamesGeering.com. And then Behind the Shield is the podcast. You can find it on all the podcast apps. On social media, it's Behind the Shield 911. I think Twitter is Behind TS 911. And Facebook, I've been in Facebook jail on my personal page. Now Behind the Shield is locked down, so I wouldn't even worry about Facebook. Just if it opens up again, great. But I don't know what they do with the metrics, but I have like almost the maximum amount of friends, and I'll post something and 6 people will like it. So I know it's not appearing on anyone's feed anyway. I'm assuming they want me to pay a lot of money to promote it, but that's not going to happen. So Instagram's the best place to find me.
Fantastic. Well, James, I've really enjoyed this conversation as usual with you, and thanks again for being on the show.
Well, thank you, mate. I really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you to everyone out there for what you do. As we spoke about in our conversation, I see you as the first responders too. I know when I was driving down my last kind of couple of months in my old fire department was when we had the hurricanes in Florida, and it was just me on the roads and then a whole bunch of your brothers and sisters driving into the storm too. So thank you all for what you do, and I see you absolutely shoulder to shoulder with us.
Thanks, James.